which we can hear has now started. So on that note, we are on 11:45. We're still on our schedule. I'll hand you over to Professor Steve King and Dr. Peter Jones. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Nigel, and thank you to Lamas for inviting us to speak. It's fabulous to be here, or be somewhere, but be present at the conference. This is, as Nigel mentioned, this is a slightly different paper to the previous one, but then again, there's a wide range across all kinds of different subjects today. So I think we fit in somewhere, within that quite well. This is a paper based on research done by Professor King, who is also here, my co-speaker, except I'm going to be actually doing the presenting. He'll be here for questions as well at the end, and myself. Steve really has done the majority of the work in this area, but he and I have worked together on it as well quite extensively. And this comes from research projects that Steve has led over the last 10 years into the narratives of the poor. In other words, pauper letters sent by the poor to the local and the national authorities, either to complain about their treatment, their relief treatment. So this is the poor law we're talking about, the old and new poor law, to complain about their treatment, to complain about the relief that they've been offered, to complain even that they've been refused relief or whatever. It's very much part of a new history from below. It's trying to work out, it's trying to think about the history of poverty through the words of the poor themselves. So that's the broad context. What we're going to be looking at today comes from the most recent of Steve's projects, which is a project called In Their Own Right, where we basically excavated the correspondence to the poor law authorities in London. That's the Poor Law Commission, later the Poor Law Board, and then the Local Government Board, which are held at the National Archives at Kew. And what we did, we excavated as many letters as we possibly could from the poor and about the poor and relating to the poor's treatment from this correspondence. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that later in the talk. But today, what we wanted to look at was a very specific cohort, if you like, of the 19th century poor. And that is what we've described, as you can see on the first slide, as the shamefaced poor. So the first task really is to think about what we mean by the shamefaced, if I can get my screen to work, there you are. What do we actually mean when we're talking about the shamefaced poor? It's clearly a strange title. Really, what we're talking about is a cohort of the poor who, I think Steve would agree, is almost entirely absent particularly from the history of the new poor law, and that is those people who found themselves in poverty, who had a good life previously. And I'm going to go into the context of the shamefaced poor a bit more, but you can see in the middle here, underlined in the middle of this slide, the phrase decayed householder, and that probably describes the shamefaced poor in a much more understandable way. So you're talking about people who had households, had a level of economic security, sometimes very high degree of economic security in their lives, and also probably had in the early modern period had a good name, had managed to keep a good name for themselves, but for whatever reason found themselves brought low economically. That could be because of old age, it could be because of sickness, or bad business deals. It could have been profligacy, personal issues that they related to, but for whatever reason they had come down considerably in the world. Why are they important? Well, they're important particularly in, again, this is more context, but in the early modern period, because they presented a particular problem to society more generally, but the poor law authorities as they stood in the early modern period. And thinking about it in a London context, in the 16th and 17th centuries, London came more and more to think about what was perceived was a problem of poverty, and the numbers of the poor who were turning up or emerging in the city, and how they could address this. And so in terms of the mid-17th century thinking, the poor tended to be categorized and tended to fall into these three broad categories. You had the poor by impotency, those who had no control over the conditions that made them poor, the aged, the very young, orphans, the blind and the lame. You had the thriftless poor. So in a sense, this is the opposite category. Those were the ones who were morally, seen to be morally culpable for their own poverty, the riotous, vagabonds, the idle, those who wouldn't work. And in the middle, you had another category, the poor by casualty. So these would have been those who were sick or injured, and quite often in contemporary thinking, wounded soldiers were sort of a great sort of emblem for this group of the poor. But also in this second group was another cohort, the decayed householder, the ones we're talking about as the shamefaced. And the important thing about this, when we look at London in this period, and this is true of cities across Europe as well, this wasn't just these weren't just theoretical categories within which to kind of categorize, how you would visualize various different types of poverty. They were structural as well. So in London, in this period, in the early modern period, institutions were established for these different types of paupers. So for the poor by impotency, and in this case, it's particularly orphans, you would have, for example, Christ Hospital would receive orphans who had nowhere else to go. For the thriftless poor and the idle poor, you would have the Bridewell, later houses of correction, and later still, as we know, workhouses. And then that poor by casualty in the middle. So in terms of the sick or the injured, you would have the growing hospital movement, and something we recognize very much as a development, as a genesis of what we understand now. And so you've got St Thomas and St Bart's in London developing at this time to receive the sick and injured poor. But that left this strange outlying category, if you like, of the decayed householder or the shamefaced poor. What did you do with them? And the interesting thing from our point of view is that in early modern thinking, the decayed householder was seen as very separate from all of these other groups, despite the fact that they were lumped in with poor by casualty. The decayed householder, quote, should be relieved at home at his own house by a weekly relief and pension. And this is a dialogue that was going on with the bishop of the bishopric and with the mayor of London at the time. And what should we do with decayed householders? Well, they should be treated very differently. And I think, you can see how they will be treated in many ways with a degree of kid gloves. They should be relieved at home. They wouldn't have to go into any of these institutions. The question, if I can just, don't want to take too long with the context, but the question is, why would this be the case? Well, there are any number of reasons why you might see this as being important, but one way of thinking about it is in the early modern period, you have a very clearly stratified society. Under God, you have people have their particular place within the social structure. You have the king, and then the aristocracy at the top, and then the middling sorts and the peasantry at the bottom, if you like. That's a caricature, but if you think about it in those terms, these are all God-given places. What happens when those who are well-to-do suddenly find that they have lost their place, that they have become part of the ranks of the very poor? How do you treat them? How does this fit with all of these kind of ideological ideas, if you like, about how society is structured? And so this is why they were viewed as the shamefaced poor. They would be too ashamed to come for charity. They had known a good life. They had a good reputation. They had a good name, which is why they were treated very differently under this situation. But when we move on to the 19th century, and particularly the new Poor Law, which was established by the Poor Law Amendment Act in 1834, things changed quite dramatically for the shamefaced poor. And this, in many ways, as I said before, is something that's not really been noted too much by historians. Because under the Poor Law Amendment Act, there was no distinction between the lumpen poor, if you like, and decayed householders. So you still had these sort of broad notions about the deserving poor, those who could do nothing about their poverty, the sick, the disabled, aged, widows, orphans. And then, in contrast to these, you had to an extent the undeserving poor, which was the able-bodied, those who could work if work was available or if they would take that work, but who weren't working. So you have these this clear distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. And the problem for the shamefaced is that they suddenly became lumped in where that was appropriate under these rules, under these new categories, with the able-bodied poor. And of course, the other thing we know about the new poor law is that, by intention at least, the workhouse was to be the new measure, particularly for the treatment of the able-bodied poor. As a deterrent measure to a large extent, if the poor were poor enough, those who could work but weren't working, if they were poor enough, then they would go in the workhouse. If not, they would go off and find ways to look after themselves. So the decayed householders, the shamefaced poor of the early modern period, suddenly find themselves rubbing shoulders with vagrants, prostitutes, with the idle, with just about everybody else in the new poor law workhouse. There was very little distinction made or account taken of their previous lives, as if they were relatively well-to-do, economically secure, if they held relatively high positions in society. Now, none of this is a new idea in 1834, of course. Workhouses have been around for 100 years by this point, but the new poor law definitely codifies it and makes it an additional problem, if you like, for the shamefaced poor. So the question then is, how does this particular group, decayed householders, if you like, who have come down in the world, how do they respond to this shift in attitude towards them, to this shift of status when they find themselves in poverty? Well, one way that we can look at that is to, as I mentioned at the beginning, look at the words that they wrote themselves and see if this can tell us anything about how they respond, how they feel about it, and how they respond to it. And this is the website for the project that recently the grant period ended. We're still working on it, but the grant period ended. It's called In Their Own Right. And what we did was we surveyed 101 unions, the correspondence in the National Archives in London. We served the correspondence for 101 unions across England and Wales. We surveyed 4 what we might describe as Greater London unions. That's Chelsea, Wandsworth and Clapham, Poplar and Bethnal Green. Overall, over all of the unions, we gathered around 5,000 letters. This is increasing all the time, but from paupers to the central authority, we gathered a hell of a lot more relating to the lives of the poor in terms of testimonies, people who wrote on behalf of the poor, witness statements and that kind of thing. But we so far have gathered more than 5,000 letters from paupers to the central authorities in London. Now, the thing that's interesting about this in terms of this talk is that these were mostly single letter writers. The poor who wrote to the poor law authorities in the 19th century, just as they had under the old poor law to their local authorities when they were writing to their local parish. They wrote a single letter to complain about their treatment, to complain about the fact that they'd been refused relief, or it was insufficient, or that relief had been cut, or as we come on more certainly under the new poor law, to complain about having been put in the workhouse or the treatment that they were receiving in the workhouse. And they complain about just about every aspect of workhouse life. I mean, there's very little that escapes their attention in these letters. Excuse me. So most of them write a single letter, some write 2, but a few, a very notable few, become serial correspondents. And these serial correspondents are so far in the unions that we've surveyed, they become especially prominent in London. Well, in the metropolitan centres generally, but in London in particular, which I think is very interesting. We're not even going to be able to address why London paupers take this action. Seemingly more than paupers elsewhere, but maybe this is something we can think about in the chat, or as part of discussions that move on from this, because it is an extremely interesting tendency. We've got our ideas, but there are really interesting reasons why the London shamefaced poor take this particular activity. Steve, did you want to come in on that? No, you weren't. Sorry, I thought you were indicating. Okay, so what do we find when we look at these letter writers, these serial letter writers, these letter writers who write over and over again to the central authorities from the workhouse specifically? Well, the first thing that we find is that what we've described as the shamefaced, decayed householders, those who've come down considerably in the world, are disproportionately, almost exclusively, represented within these serial letter writers. And we'll go on to look at this, look at a few examples in a moment. But there are certain characteristics of their serial letter writing which are common as well. And again, this very much applies to our London letter writers. So like most, in fact, all pauper correspondence, they begin with a personal or a specific complaint. That's something to do with their own particular treatment in the workhouse, or if they're outside of it, they're, you know, externally. But we're talking about workhouse paupers. They begin with a personal, very specific complaint about a particular incident, a particular unjust situation that they themselves have faced. But our serial letter writers then quite quickly broaden out to general complaints within the workhouse that affect them, but may well affect a much larger cohort. And then they go on to write for or on behalf of other paupers, and sometimes multiple paupers. Mostly in their own name. They'll write on behalf of Thomas Rosamond or Derek Bailey, who's also got a problem, and this, that, and the other. But sometimes they do it anonymously, and we can follow through on their handwriting. So they're, in a way, they're kind of, they are establishing a correspondence, if you like, a critical mass of correspondence about issues within the workhouse, not just for themselves, but on behalf and sometimes in the name of other paupers as well. And occasionally, not that occasionally, quite, you know, relatively often, given that we've only surveyed these few unions so far in London, occasionally their letter writing, their serial correspondence develops into a specific campaign. And those campaigns are most often about their own workhouse and how it's run, and the board of guardians who are running it, and the way that the poor law locally is generally administered. And sometimes they even bleed into national ideas about the poor law more generally, and how and why it's poorly run and how it should be done better. So when they're doing this, they implicitly or they explicitly often key into or tie into wider calls for workhouse reform and wider workhouse reform movements that are going on at the time. And this is particularly true after the middle of the 19th century. And they also very often threaten or commit to other forms of action to maintain this campaign about the workhouse system or the poor law system in their locality, or even beyond that. And they do this through letter writing campaigns to newspapers, either anonymously or by name, pamphlet writing sometimes, exposés. So they try to encourage, if you like, a head of steam locally to address particular issues of the way the workhouse is run and that kind of thing. And they become the head of these things. So I just want to briefly go on, let me see the time, I'm okay so far. I just want to briefly go on and have a look at some names. So these are some of the examples of those who we would call serial correspondents, who are drawn from decayed householders, or what would once have been known as the shamefaced poor. You've got Thomas Gould, who writes 11 letters from Poplar. You've got Thomas Harvey, who writes 6 letters. Frank Burge, who in many ways is a celebrity, he's the father of all of these. In 6 letters, he writes 16,000 words in less than a 2-year period, about an 18-month period. Now that's a postgraduate taught dissertation. I mean, we're not talking brevity here. He's an astonishing correspondent. And all the time he is writing whilst he's resident in the Poplar workhouse. Then you've got John Rutherford, who interestingly was a writer and a journalist. He was a published writer before he went into the workhouse. He was a published writer after he emerged from the workhouse. And in fact, he actually, in some ways, made his name as the writer of a work, if you like, a picaresque account of what life was like in the workhouse once he'd left Poplar workhouse. He's a very interesting character. You can actually find his some of his material on Google. You can actually Google it in Google Books, and you can still find some of his material out there that he authored. He wrote 5 letters from Poplar. In Bethnal Green, we have less of these represented. So I'm specifically dealing here, I should have mentioned this before, with the East End of London, Poplar and Bethnal Green, because they are very well represented for our serial letter writers. Mungo Paumier who is described here as an ex-school teacher and clerk, he wrote 12 letters from Bethnal Green Workhouse. And I just want to have another quick look in more detail at Mungo, because we're very lucky in knowing a lot more about Mungo Pauper and his life prior to his stay in the workhouse than we do about almost all the other paupers that we're talking about here, and most other paupers that we know about across the country. Because he wrote, it turns out that he wrote a personal memoir detailing his family history and his life up to 1859 when he wrote this memoir. It remains unpublished, and we're very, very grateful to Brian and Valerie Kemp. Valerie is one of Mungo's direct descendants, and the memoir, as you can see it here, illustrated by Mungo himself, still rests in their hands, and they've transcribed it and let us see it. So we're extraordinarily grateful for them for letting us look at this. But from this memoir, we know a lot about Pauper, and when we're thinking about the nature of shamefaced poverty, he's a great example. He was born in Dublin in the late 18th century. He was the grandson of extremely wealthy Huguenot migrants who set up the first sugar refinery warehouses in Dublin, in Mullinahack, which is near the docks in Dublin. Mungo himself was employed in Ireland in many positions as a senior clerk and manager in many of the merchant houses. And when he was born, the family was still very wealthy. The family's wealth had been divided amongst the sons, so his father had a large portion of it. But he could never settle to any job, and he says this in his own memoir. He found it very difficult to settle to any of these jobs, so he basically drifted, and then he eventually drifted to England and came to London in 1819. But once again, he failed to stick at any particular position. He had a number, again, of clerical positions and managerial positions in quite some major organizations, but they never lasted very long. Nonetheless, he got married. He fathered 12 children, 11 of whom survived, and his wife and children survived throughout the period that he was writing this memoir. The interesting thing is that 6 years before he wrote this memoir in 1856, it's clear, he said, and he details this himself, he was alternately sleeping at home, he was sleeping in lodging houses, cheap lodging houses, and he was even sleeping in Parkland in London. So he had come a very, very long way down from his original origins. As I say, he wrote this memoir. It's really interesting because it's very detailed about his family and his background and to an extent his life, but there is no sense about why his life took the pattern that it did. Very rarely does he give any specific or even general reasons why he came down so far in the world, except that it was generally somebody else's fault. So he was made promises that were not fulfilled by employees and others. The family was badly used by those who advised them financially. He was badly used by people who took his money, invested it, and he lost it, and all this kind of thing. So essentially, the memoir is a self-justifying attempt to kind of, it is to an extent a mea culpa, but it's sort of very self-justifying mea culpa for his sons. He specifically says this, for his sons, to explain why he has come down to this level, from all the way from being part of this very, very wealthy Dublin family. Things got even worse after he'd written the memoir. So in 1859, he was prosecuted for stealing from his employers. He was actually acquitted from that. We know this from the Old Bailey records, Old Bailey Online records, but it's very difficult looking at the evidence to see why he was acquitted, because it's fairly incontrovertible that he did actually steal a cheque for £31 from his employers, which happened to be a parish priest, and that he'd done this, but somehow he was acquitted. And it's more than possible that he was a very plausible, very well-spoken man who could argue his case for a special pleading, if you like. But thereafter, he first entered Bethnal Green in 1862, and he left and returned many times before finally dying in Bethnal Green Workhouse in 1872. So over the last 10 years of his life, he was in and out of the workhouse many times. Whilst he was in the workhouse, as I said, as we mentioned before, he mounted his serial letter writing campaign. And so he very much followed this pattern that we've suggested for these serial letter writers. It began as complaints about the fact that he was not allowed out when he felt he should be as an elderly pauper, that he was, you know, the master in particular didn't like him. But as his correspondence unfolded, it became more and more systematic about his place in workhouse reform in Bethnal Green. So he claimed to have helped to get rid of the workhouse master, Theo Merrick, in 1866. He claimed to have been instrumental in getting rid of Theo Merrick. And this was a cause célèbre in Bethnal Green. Theo Merrick was a man who desperately clung on to his role as workhouse master, despite all of the evidence that he was of misconduct. And I won't go into details. Some of it's quite juicy, but I won't go into details about Theo Merrick. He claimed to be a confidant in this, of a dissenting guardian, one of the guardians who was also trying to get rid of Theo Merrick, Robert Onions. He not only wrote to the Central Poor Law authorities, but he wrote several letters of complaint to local newspapers, which were published. He had this poem published anonymously in the East London Observer in September 1871. I wouldn't dwell on it. It's not a great piece of romantic poetry by any means, but nonetheless, he wrote and had it published. And crucially, he also gained, crucially for us, he gained some notoriety locally as a result of all of these activities. He was regularly mentioned in reports and editorials on the workhouse and in the situation with Theo Merrick and other members of staff who were disciplined, and eventually some of the workhouse surgeons were also dismissed. He was mentioned in reports about this. He was also mentioned in reports from the Board of Guardians, which were reported in the local press. And he even appeared on the platform of a protest in London Fields in 1867, a protest meeting about the situation in the workhouse and called for reform. As something of a celebrity speaker, a guest speaker on that platform. So just to conclude, I think I've still got a couple of minutes. Yeah, I've got a couple of minutes. So just to conclude, I think basically what Mungo's case and what most of these other cases, without having the time to go into the actual content of their letters, it does cause us, give us pause to think about what happened to, if you like, decayed householders, the shamefaced poor, those we would recognize now, who have had a high degree of economic status, maybe a good name, maybe a relatively high social standing, but have come down in the world for whatever reasons. What happens when they confront a fairly unforgiving welfare regime, welfare state now, but welfare regime under the new poor law? Because in many ways, before the era of state pensions, or in particular state pensions, there was a very, very good chance that these people would at some point in their life encounter relief authorities. But as we've already mentioned, by the 19th century, there was a great loss of status. They were no longer seen as deserving. They were simply part of the great mass of the poor. So they not only lost their economic security, but they lost, if you like, their reputation, or they stood the chance of losing their reputation, their good name. And especially for men, I think that you can say that this was important, not exclusively by any means. I should say that the serial letter writers that we have from London are exclusively male, the ones that fit this kind of profile, but that's not true nationally. We have a woman called Frances Land, for example, who's I know Steve King is very fond of, from Great Yarmouth, who writes a very similar series of letters over a very long period of time. So it's not exclusively men, but in London they tend to be men who have lost their good name. But what we're arguing here is that this serial correspondence, these long campaigns that they mounted in correspondence, even though you have to remember, and I should possibly have kept this at the forefront all the time, these guys are in the workhouse. They're workhouse paupers, and we have a very peculiar or particular idea of what the workhouse was like and what the workhouse poor were like. But nonetheless, they were still able to mount these tremendous campaigns. And in some ways, what they did, I think, is that we can kind of conjecture at least that they gave the shamefaced a voice that they would otherwise have lost in society, in local affairs. They could be used to re-engage, if you like, with civic life and reaffirm active citizenship even though these were the workhouse poor, and in many people's eyes, the lowest of the low. So I think that it's fair to say, whether we all agree or not, I think it's fair to say that they gave at least the illusion of some kind of influence, some kind of agency, and they contributed to psychological resilience for these people for whom their situation appeared to be otherwise lost, if nothing else. A bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'll stop there and look forward to any questions that you have. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And Stephen and audience, as you've probably learned by now, you can use the Q&A for any questions you might have. I've got a couple here already, or you can just use the chat to send in any note to our speakers, just to say thanks, to anything you want to raise to their attention, or any general points. Thank you, John's popped some questions in. So I've got a couple of questions for you that you won't have seen come in. One of them from Alan says, did the majority of shamefaced poor have good education and literacy skills, therefore? And would they write letters on behalf of others who perhaps had less literacy skills, I guess?
So I hand over to you, Steve.
So the answer is to the first question is mostly, but it's not universally true. I mean, we have some serial authors, some in London, but mostly elsewhere, who basically had orthographic literacy, i.e. they wrote as they spoke, but they still wrote in a sustained way. But by definition, the shamefaced poor are likely to have had an education. And do they write on behalf of others? So we do have instances where, so most of these writers claim to speak for others in their own text. You know, so-and-so can't write or doesn't want to write or is scared to write. But we do have others, particularly in Wales and the Midlands, where somebody writes a letter because we know the hand, and then somebody else signs it. So we do have instances like that. Absolutely right.
Okay, thank you. And I've got a couple more questions come in. I'll read them out for the attendees. One is from Brenda Hawkins. Brenda says she has used MH12 in the early period for rural unions and found it very useful, but has not come across letters from the paupers themselves. Are these bound into volumes or separately indexed?
So they're bound into volumes, and the point about MH12 is that they're bound into volumes by year, and they basically, in the order in which stuff comes in, it is then bound up. So as long as the volume survives, you can be sure that you've got absolutely everything that was sent into the central authorities. The problem for us is it's absolutely everything. So any sort of junk can appear in here, as well as pauper letters. And for some unions, the yield is very small, but for other unions, it's absolutely fantastic. So it's luck of the draw. Many of our rural unions are very well documented. So it's chance, really. And it takes a big effort to find these things.
Thank you. And a question from Thamer McIver. Really interesting, gents, thanks. Is there any suggestion that the writers found obstacles placed in their way? For example, difficulties obtaining writing materials?
Peter, do you want to say something about that? Or
yeah, this is something that we as a project have talked a huge amount about. Yes, is the short answer. Not in every case by any means, and very often, you know, it's clear that, in fact, I would say for the majority of the cases, I think Steve, I don't know whether Steve would agree, in the majority of cases, paupers find relative ease in getting writing materials, but paupers, one of the complaints that paupers will make is that they are having all kinds of obstacles put in their way, and writing materials is one of them. We have got letters occasionally written on some bizarre things, so floral kind of writing paper. They're obviously scraps of paper, bags, or leaflets on the back of flyers, that kind of thing. So they're making sure that they can get the materials to write regardless of the obstacles that are put in their way. The other thing, Mungo is a great example of this, is that they complain about the fact that having written, the first thing that the central authorities do is to notify their local authorities that they have written, and having written, they are then punished specifically for writing.
Okay.
And with serial letters, this is clearly a problem, because they become a problem for the local authority, for the local poor law authority, local guardians, because they're complaining endlessly about a range of things. So the punishments tend to get ramped up, and this becomes if you like, a battle of wills. In some ways, it's astonishing resilience that they continue to do this regardless of everything that is put in their way.
Yep.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm going to invite one of our panelists. Val, I'm not sure if you have a question or you've just given the guys a wave, but you have the air if you want for a moment, Val. She might just be giving you a wave.
I just wanted to say how powerful I think it is to have the real words from someone from the past. And you've got a group of people that we just didn't really know about. But we talk sometimes about the value of diaries and letters and so on, but it's that real word stuff. It brings you so close. And I just wanted to say how exciting it was to have that sort of connection. And in a way, it comes into my talk in a few minutes, because I've got newspaper reports where the journalist is on the spot at the disaster and describing what's happened, but he's quoting what people tell him. And it's the nearest we can get to a sort of, it's like a modern broadcast, that the BBC have sent some poor sod to stand in the rain at a disaster, and they have to make a story of it. And it's that power of real words. I think it's very exciting when you get it, and thank you.
Thank you.
Right. And I absolutely agree with you. All of these ways of really anchoring real words, because resilience is located in the individual. In the end, we can focus on resilience of place and of community, but in the end, it's about individuals. So I think you're absolutely right. Getting the ordinary voice is fantastic.
Thank you. And thank you, Val. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Stephen. We're coming up to 12:20. The next speaker you will hear will indeed be Val, but ladies and gentlemen in the audience, you've got around 9 minutes if you want to do a quick top up or a quick comfort break, because our next speaker will be coming on at 12:30. And whilst you're grabbing a quick break, attendees, Peter, Stephen, don't disappear yet. I can see another question coming in from Jane Cooper, who asks, how often did the complainers champion Workhouse children's welfare? Oh, I can see Peter's replying.
I started replying actually, but I didn't complete it. So I think Steve should answer this, to be perfectly honest.
Well, so we've done some specific work on workhouse children, and the argument that we make essentially is that by the later 19th century in particular, they are a flashpoint for all of the ills of the workhouse, and all writers, including serial writers, come to focus on children and children's issues and the way they're treated as a point of contention with the central authorities, and it becomes very charged indeed. But we also have some of the voices of children themselves, and some of these children are in scandalous situations in the workhouse where they're badly mistreated and all the rest of it. But then you get some other activist voices. So, for instance, we have children who literally make up accusations against masters and staff about all sorts of abuse. Literally make it up. There's an inquiry, and only later, when they're slightly older, do they then admit the whole thing is made up and they just did it because they didn't like the person. So you see real agency on the part of children as well as their vulnerability. But Peter might want to add more to that.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And it is interesting that even many of the adult paupers in workhouses, keying into Steve's point about children becoming a flashpoint, will put their head above the parapet, despite the fact that it's not an issue for them, and despite the fact that they know that it's likely that they will be punished for complaining. They very often, even in the earlier period, will write on behalf of children who they have seen abused, beaten unconscionably or whatever, and they are actually prepared to put themselves on the line for this. So again, it's there's the whole issue of agency is a very large and important one that Steve's work in particular addresses.
Maybe I can just literally very quickly add, Jeff James, who leads the National Archives, is working on a project at the moment where if you look at Marylebone, Workhouse, there is a fantastically detailed and colourful incident which reaches the national press all over the country, in which the workhouse master strips teenage girls and flogs them below the waist. And this is hugely contentious, and you can read it in many ways, but I think actually some of it is absolute lies, simply to make the workhouse in Marylebone notorious. And so you can really begin to feel these sorts of instances from MH12.
Thank you. And once again, thanks to Peter and Stephen. If you're interested in the topic, I'm sure if you reach out to them, they'll correspond with you, and we can get to the details later if you wish.
Yep.
I'll pause.